secular justice is man-made or human being made. It's in the form of written laws, in the form of judicial decisions that become part of the common law, and very importantly, it's administered by human beings. It's all secular in distinction to God's justice. Now that doesn't mean, and I'll give you examples, that it's different, that it's in the sense that it's concerned with subjects that aren't the concern of God's justice, etc. That might be true in some respects, but in many important respects they are concerned with the same thing. A good example of secular justice is a statute passed by the legislature, and the example I have here is the Ontario Human Rights Code, which has its origin in Ontario legislation, I believe, in the early 40s, and it's grown substantially since then, but its preamble and the current version succinctly states its concern and its purpose. And the preamble is, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. The people, of course, under the law, paying their taxes, it's regarded as as it has for certainly a century and a half, I would like to think, the responsibility that we all have to look after those who are less fortunate than a lot of us. That's the business of government. It's the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And Section 15 of the Charter provides that every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination.
That principles of justice that we may value in society and culture are wrong, and that God's justice is right. It's not so much that there's an opposition between the two, but there is a rootedness in God that is different. One of the basic differences, I think, is that God's justice is never blind. You know, one of the big principles of the justice system is the concept of blind justice. So we have the image of the woman who is blindfolded, who represents the impartiality of justice. God's justice is partial in that God has an intention for creation, and it's expressed in the biblical text in terms of ideas such as caring for those who are most vulnerable in society and culture. God isn't blind to the plight of people like that. In fact, God chooses to support them and invites in God's covenant all those who have faith to be concerned with those who care, to care for those who are most vulnerable in society.
And that for me is pivotal, because I used to not see much difference. I used to just picture this concept of justice like most people would picture it, two scales, and that would be either in God's kingdom or in our court system. That's how the concept of justice is portrayed. However, the more I've been thinking and reading about it, I think that there's an element of God's justice that is meant to be restorative and not just punitive. So in our court systems, there's obviously consequences for your actions and you're punished, or you have to pay retribution or those kind of things. Not that that's necessarily different in God's kingdom, but I wonder if our secular thinking misses that element of restoration. So if you look at Old Testament, there's something about when weak people come into a community, the stronger people are to watch for them. So if they're the oppressed or the widows, the orphans, they're to be brought back into a larger, stronger community and made strong as part of that community. And there's that element of restoration that I wonder if it's missing as we think about secular justice. It's not, secular justice isn't as much filled with hope, and there isn't this element of mercy that comes alongside of it, but in God's kingdom and structure, I think restoration is a huge piece that I can't actually picture it without that at this point.
It's an alternate view of secular justice in the correctional system, and it out of that sort of biblical vision of restorative justice, that the victim and offender reconciliation program emerged about 25 years ago. That not for all crimes, but for certain kinds of crimes, and where there's an agreement by the victim to come together with the offender. The circles of support, for example, is another initiative that for would be sexual offenders, that once they're released into the community, they have a circle of people in the churches who support them, so that there's constant support, in a sense constant monitoring isn't the right word because that isn't their responsibility, but people who will walk with people who committed these crimes on their journey.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very different approach to justice than simply incarcerating people and leaving them there.
For a long while I corresponded with a boy who was in prison. In prison probably for about 14 years. He had been abused by his grandfather. He twice got his mother with a rope around her neck. He was highly intelligent, so they couldn't deal with him at school, so they put him into a kind of remand home, kind of juvenile prison. When he was, I think, 16, he was involved in armed robbery. He didn't kill anybody, he didn't shoot anybody, but he was involved, and he was sent to prison. And that would seem to be human justice. This boy has done wrong, he goes into prison. He was effectively removed from human society for somewhere in the region of 14 years. At no time until probably the last 3 months in which he was in prison did anybody recognise that this guy had an incredibly high IQ. He had the possibility of going to university once he was out. He had done some examinations, but his potential to love, his potential to act responsibly, his potential to learn had been demeaned and denied by a system which seemed to be to do with justice, but actually it was about incarceration. Now sadly, he has died in the past 2 years. But I believe that God's justice differentiates in that instance clearly from what was human punishment. God's justice would both have required him to pay the price for his misdemeanour, but God's justice would also have released in him and have found in him the goodness which the prison system denied. And probably God's justice would have, and now in heaven, pray God this does happen, will allow him to understand why he went off the rails. And in the merciful embrace of God, he'll be reconciled to all whom he have offended and forgiven for what he's done wrong.